I'm Joshua Bardwell, and you're going to learn something today. Today, you're going to learn how to build a CheaterKwad. What's a CheaterKwad? A CheaterKwad is a quad with 2 or more cameras and a video switcher that lets you switch between the cameras without the audience necessarily knowing that you're doing it. So you can make your quadcopter do amazing things that make people go, WTF, how did he do that? Like you could fly the quad backwards, but to you, it's not flying backwards because you switched to a backwards facing camera. And then suddenly the GoPro's going the other direction and people are like, did he reverse the footage? What did he do? Yeah, CheaterKwad. The other place I've seen CheaterKwads used is with 3D quads. 3D quad can flip upside down and reverse the props so it flies upside down basically. And that's a whole nother discipline that people really struggle to learn. But if you have a CheaterKwad, you just put an upside down camera on it. And then when you flip over upside down, you just switch cameras and now you're just flying right side up and everybody's like, this guy's the best 3D pilot in the world. How did he get so good? CheaterKwad. And that's what we're going to do today. We're going to build a CheaterKwad. Stay tuned. This video is going to be in 2 pieces. You're watching the first part now, and the first part is just where we build the quadcopter. So I'm going to do a build video with some components that I'll tell you about in a second where we build the CheaterKwad. And essentially the only thing that's unique about this build is that we've got a second camera and a video switcher set up. Then once the build is done, we're going to do part 2, which is the actual CheaterKwad part where we set up the, how is it going to happen that when we flip the camera to face backwards that how do our controls still work right? That's going to be part 2. So let's get into the build and we'll start by going over the parts that I'm going to be using in this build. And the first thing we'll look at is the frame. And the frame is a Lindworm frame. Lindworm is a company that I hadn't heard of until a local guy here in Knoxville said, hey, I think Lindworm is actually local to Knoxville, or at least they know somebody in Knoxville who got a hold of me. And I picked this frame because when I first looked, got some more tape to get rid of. When I first saw this frame, I thought this frame would actually be perfect for a CheaterKwad because of sort of how symmetrical it is and how, it's a perfect fit for a backwards facing camera. So, now I got to think that he probably stuffed this in here just for me, but yes, the way to my heart, Lindworm. Newbie drone, watch your back. Watch your back, newbie drone. Oh yeah. I love me some neck straps. This one's a little too, it's a little tight. Okay. 2 of them in here. Thank you, Lindworm. Battery straps, of course, as usual. And, I prefer newbie drone battery straps as well. See, these look like pretty high quality battery straps. They have Kevlar stitching, so they're very strong. But what this kills it for me is that they're not rubberized. I really, really prefer rubberized battery straps. And I found that that helps keep the battery from sliding around in a crash. I also use Grip, or if you don't want to use the branded Grip, you can use any kind of cheap gel padding. I do think the Grip works a little bit better, but the gel padding is fine too. But I would actually prefer a weaker battery strap with rubberization than a nice strong Kevlar battery strap without rubberization, because I double up the battery straps on all my builds anyway. And if you double the battery straps, one in front, one in back, they don't tend to break, but they will slip if they're not rubberized. So, okay, here's the frame, and isn't that kind? It came pre-built. Well, thank you for doing my work for me, Lindworm. Let's just take a quick look at this frame, and you can see. Okay, so how much is there to say about? That's why I don't review frames very much. How much is there to say about frames of this type? Not so much, but this frame does have some really nice touches that I think make it worth taking a look at. So the frame does have replaceable arms. It doesn't have a solid bottom plate, similar to the original Alien. And it does have this design where the arms come together in the middle that we're seeing on frames like the Schizo Nova or the new QAV-R V2, whatever they're calling it. though they come together in the middle. It doesn't have that feature that the Schizo Nova has, where the arms are actually they swirl a little bit and they lock in. That's a really nice feature on the Schizo Nova that I like a lot. These arms, they come together just at a regular X, which can be a problem. If you look at the Johnny FPV frame, I've heard reports from some people flying the Johnny FPV frame that under stress, the arm will kind of want to cam out a little bit. But that is not going to be a problem on this frame, because if you look carefully, you'll see 1, 2, 3. These standoff screws are actually going up through the frame, and the arm actually has this big triangular section here that's holding it in. So it's braced here for strength. That's a good thing. But ultimately, this joint is not actually the main thing holding it together. Now, it does mean you're going to have more screws to remove if you have to change an arm. You're going to be pulling these standoff screws out as well. But it certainly also means that it's definitely not going anywhere. I also really like this approach here. This curve here is going to reduce some of the stresses. So if we were to take this support off here and just come in this way and come to here, then we would have a lot of stress at this point and a lot of leverage. Adding this support here and radiusing this, that's going to help. This would be a common break point if you didn't have this. So it's very nice. The end of the arm has a notch here, and that's not just cosmetic. The purpose of that is that you run your motor wires out this direction and then around the underside of the arm, and then they come up through this notch, and that protects the motor wires from getting struck by a prop. Having this notch here for the motor wires to run in prevents them from getting cut or damaged when you take a cartwheel crash, and that's a pretty clever design. That's not the first, but by far not the first frame to do that, but it is a nice approach. There's some argument that having the wires on bottom is almost as bad as having them on top, because on bottom, then you're constantly going to be landing on them if you don't have any kind of landing skids or anything. And especially if you do a lot of flying on concrete and asphalt, that can wear at them pretty quickly. Also, if you're going to do anything like those cool light up race wire LEDs that I used on my perfect build, you're going to want the wires on top of the arms, and you're not going to really use this feature. The other advantage of this is that these little pointy bits also help protect the motor a little bit in crashes. You sometimes see them coming around the front as well. So this isn't going to protect quite as well as something where the little ridged bits stick out the front, but it is going to help protect a little bit, depending on the size of your motor, I guess. Here are the mounting holes for the flight control stack, and it is drilled for a 36mm and a 20mm stack. More and more people are running 20mm stacks, even on 5-inch builds. I'm not sure I understand the logic. It's not like we don't have plenty of room here, but hey, whatever makes you happy. And I used to would have said that 20mm ESCs are just not up to the amps that are drawn by 5-inch quads. But I think I'm seeing more and more 20mm ESCs that are rated for 25 or even 30 amps. And I kind of don't know how you do that without them just blowing up. But hey, apparently you can. Okay, so 36mm or 20mm. And there's an additional mounting on the back. And again, we're seeing more and more frames that are doing this. A little hard to get this on camera, but there's a 20mm set of mounting holes here on the back. This standoff is in the way of the front. See these holes here? If you did have a 20mm board, the standoff would be in the way. I suppose what you're supposed to do is like 3D print some kind of a plate to put stuff on. But if you actually had like a 20mm VTX, I think you'd have to remove this standoff. And then would you be compromising the integrity of the frame? Good question. Now here at the back of the frame is what made me say this would be perfect for a CheaterKwad, because you can see that the frame plate is actually symmetrical. This right here is the camera mounting slots for the camera mounting bracket, which of course you see right here. And we're just going to stick another set of these in, which the designer has kindly sent me, and we're going to have a backwards facing camera. So won't that be cool? But this is actually symmetrical. And is it fully symmetrical? I see he hasn't drilled. Okay, so he hasn't drilled here, so it's not fully symmetrical. So WTF then is the point of having these holes here? I don't actually know. Here he's drilled these holes, and I believe that's for if you're using the older style of mounting where you've just got that U-shaped piece of aluminum bracket with a screw coming up through the bottom. Don't use that. Don't ever use that. That thing is stupid and ridiculous. Just use the regular camera mounting here for the frame. Very nice touch that we've got countersunk screws here on the back, and that's going to help keep those screws from digging into your battery. Though, of course, you're going to want to use a battery pad so that you have some grip and stuff and padding. But if you didn't want to put your battery flat, you could do it, and you're going to easily be able to put your battery pad here, although you need to take it off to get at the screws, I suppose. Also notice that this plate also has mounting holes cut in it. And it's not because we're reusing this plate anywhere. This same plate is not reused anywhere else in the build. So I suppose you could do kind of like a remix and mount things to the top plate if you so desired. I don't usually like to do that because I want to be able to take my top plate off easily for maintenance. But hey, yeah, some stuff going on here. To be honest with you, there's some stuff going on here that I don't fully understand. Maybe I should, well, anyway, there you go. The Lindworm frame. Clearly a lot of thought put into this design. Thanks to Lindworm for sending it to me. For motors, I hit up my friends at Get FPV and said, what you got? What you got? What is it that you would like to see on this build? Because I want some free motors, please. And they suggested that I use these 2207, 2450 kV Zip motors. These are, Zip is, well, like, what's the, Xylo. Xylo is Luminier's kind of like OEM budget brand. And then the Zip motors are actually made in-house in their own factory and are a little higher quality. These are 2207 and I picked 2450 kV just because I thought that'd be a good all round for just, you can run kind of any prop you want on these. And they do have the Popo Pro system where there's no prop nuts on this guy. You just use any tool you got, like a hex wrench or something, to push in this little button here and it releases these little grips, and that's how you install your props. A lot of people have questioned this when it first came out, questioned the reliability and so forth. But I gotta say, it's not perfect, but then prop nuts aren't perfect either. Prop nuts strip out, prop nuts come off. If you turtle mode too aggressively, prop nuts will loosen up. So this system has really exceeded my expectations. Not just for me, because how many packs a week do I fly, but I've actually stayed in touch with some people who fly these motors pretty much day in and day out and fly them pretty aggressively, and they stand by them and love them. And a lot of concerns about, oh, will this get bound up or gunked up, or will the buttons stick, or will it be unreliable, or will the prop pop off? It's not that those things never happen, but they seldom happen, and this is a great solution for some people who just don't want to deal with prop nuts at all. So these are the motors we're going to use. The flight controller is going to be the Lumenier Lux F7 Ultimate, and the reason for that is that it has built-in camera switching. It can camera switch without any additional accessory board. Now, if you're going to set up a CheaterKwad, you can do this with a third-party accessory board, just a little thing that sits in between the camera and the flight controller and flips between the cameras. And in fact, if you're going to do some of the more ambitious CheaterKwads with 3 or even 4 cameras, you're going to need to do that because this guy only can switch 2 cameras. But if you wanted to do that, you absolutely could do it with this flight controller. Just add 1 more switcher and now you can do 3 cameras. 2 on the switcher and 1 on the flight controller. You should see how that would work. Anyway, that's more complicated. We're just going to start simple here and do a 2-camera CheaterKwad. I have a full review of this flight controller, including 2 videos. One is a review, and then one is how to set up the camera switching, and it can also turn your VTX on and off as well. And I'll link to that down in the video description. Finally, the ESCs that we're going to use for this build are the new Holy Bro BL Heli F3 processor ESCs. This is an ESC with the same F3 processor that like the SP Racing F3 flight controller had. So it's way, way faster. And I gotta tell you, I'm so anti-hype train about so many things. So when I heard about these, I went to people who I trust, like Ryan Harrell, who knows everything about ESCs. And I said, is there even a freaking point to this? And he said, no. The F3 is not really being used now in terms of what BL Heli is asking of it. They just don't need those additional processor cycles, but future proofing. Anyway, we're going to put them on this flight because why not, right? Let's try something new. Well, all right. That's basically the most important parts of the build. The VTX cameras. I'm just going to grab something off the shelf. I don't really care. Let's get to the build. Now, these motors come with screws like most motors do, but there's 2 things I don't like about these screws. One of them I could live with and one I cannot. The one I could live with is that the screws are button head screws. That's as opposed to this type, which is a cap head screw. For motor screws, I greatly prefer cap head screws. And the reason is that the cap head screws, it just has a much bigger head. It's more durable to scuffing from asphalt and concrete. And if you fill it up with mud, it's a lot easier to clean it out just because it has an extra little 0.5 millimeter of space there to get in. It's also, I almost never strip these out, whereas button head screws, even when they're high quality, well, these are high quality. These are 12.9, so they might not strip, but it's really just too easy to strip because this head is not very deep, so there's not very much room to get the screwdriver in there. But the thing that I cannot live with, I could live with that, and in fact, I would use these just to save me the trouble of digging through my box of screws to find the right length. What I cannot live with pertains to the length, and if you look here, you can see that that screw is barely half of the way up through the motor base. So what I want is at least, I really ideally want the screw to be almost all the way up through the motor base. The reason that's the case is that this is a 5 millimeter bottom plate and these screws are sized obviously for 4 millimeter or something like that. So what I've done is I've gone and found some screws from my box of screws that are just about perfect. And you can see there, the screw gets almost all the way through, but does not stick up above the motor base. I want it to be just a little bit shy of the motor base. And the reason for that is that if it sticks up too far, it can touch the motor windings and damage the motor. Now, that's not really a risk here. You can see that I have several millimeters, a couple millimeters of space between here and the motor winding, but I would be a little bit concerned here. And these wires are well protected. They have heat shrink on them. And so if it did stick up and make a little bit of contact, it probably wouldn't be an issue, but I wouldn't love it. There's so much vibration and shock on a quad. I would worry that that screw head touching here would be an issue. So I'm going to use these that I've got from my big old box of screws, and they are exactly the right size so that when you tighten them down, you're going to need to use the 2.5 millimeter driver. Thank you very much. They're exactly the right size so that when you tighten them down, they will not stick out and protrude above. See? Perfect. Now here's something I haven't done in a long while, and that is solder up an ESC. I've been using 4-in-1 ESCs for almost all of my builds, but welcome to the club. We're going to be doing individual ESCs on this one and, you know, go back to the way it used to be. Now I'm going to solder the wires onto the side of the ESC. Here, let me get one that isn't stuck down. I'm going to solder the wires onto the side of the ESC that has the FETs. This side has the capacitors and the microcontroller, and these here are the FETs. And I like to put the FETs up because the FETs are what gets hot and needs cooling. So having them exposed to the airflow will help them stay cooler as opposed to putting them down, which also would mean that these capacitors might be subject to a prop strike or the microcontroller. Now the FETs don't love prop strikes either, but yeah, anyway, FET side up. The ESCs come with a bunch of wires, so easy to do that. I am going to prep the wires myself. I'm not going to use the factory solder. The factory solder is usually lead-free and it flows really poorly. I'm going to be using my hemostat to hold the wires for this process. It's a great tool to have, and I did confirm in a previous video that this is a hemostat. I wasn't sure what the difference between a hemostat and a forceps was. People told me that a hemostat is a special case of a forceps, that a forceps is a non-locking and a hemostat is locking. I don't know if that's true, but somebody said it on the internet, so it must be true. Ooh, that's a good joint right there. This one could be better. Let me add a little more solder here. There you go. Now that's what that's supposed to look like. Now let me head off the question that you ought to be asking right now. which is, why am I not using this additional ground pad? And the answer to that is this ground pad is supposed to be for the signal ground. And if the flight controller is not basically right next to the ESC, having a second ground wire going to the flight controller can help the signal be less corrupted. But the wiring on modern quadcopters, the PDB and the flight controller are never very far apart. So there's not really much use for the second ground. Some people swear by it. I think in most modern builds, it's not really necessary. And in this case, it's going to save me one joint. I'm also not going to do the telemetry because just screw it. Let's get this quad in the air. So I'm going to save myself a couple joints and leave those off. Next, I'm going to take some of this Scotch foam mounting tape and cut it to size. I like to use this stuff on the underside of the ESC. Not really because the ESC needs to be stuck down, just because the ESC needs something to keep it from touching the carbon fiber arm and shorting out. And also it provides a little bit of shock absorption to just, you know, when you take a hard smack, the ESC doesn't take all of the impact. Old school. Once that's stuck down, then we will cut these guys to length. What I like to do is just hold the wire in place and cut it maybe 2 millimeters past where it's going to end up needing to be. Then strip. That's why I give myself an extra 2 millimeters, because I'll often like a strip back too far or something. Twist the wires together so they're not any like loose ones sticking out like this guy here. See how it's all sticking out? And then I'm going to tin the wires. If you're a noob, you may not want to tin the wires with the ESC like right here, because a glob of solder could come off your iron and get on the ESC and ruin it. But I like to live dangerously. So you could just put down something if you like, or hold the wire out of the way. Now I'm going to cut these guys. They're a little too long right now, and they're going to just, see how it'll stick off the edge? It's so long that it'll either touch the FET or it'll hang off the edge, and that's not good. So I'm going to cut these guys down to maybe 2 millimeters. Can I just say, you know, like as an American, I've always been a little bit suspicious of the metric system. You know, that's how we are. But you guys are totally killing it with millimeters. Like centimeters versus inches, who cares? You know, whatever, it doesn't matter. But millimeters are so much better for measuring small things than fractions of an inch. Fractions of an inch are stupid. 1/8 of an inch. Yeah, no, stupid. Millimeters are that's what's going to get me onto the metric system, is millimeters. No, those are not terrible. Those are not terrible. Let's take a close look at those. We've got a decent fillet, which is where the sort of smooth arc where the puddle joins the pad. There's no crags or it's bumpy parts. It's silver. It's not bad. I'd really ideally like to see like a ball, but that can be a little hard to get sometimes. And overall, I'm kind of okay with each of them. Has a nice smooth fillet going from the edge of the wire down to the pad. Yeah, it's not the worst. All 4 ESCs have now been installed and the motor wires are soldered up to them. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start building the stack. There's a lot of debate about how to build the flight control stack one way to do it is to use long screws that go up through the base, and then all the boards set down on the screws with spacers in between them. The other way to do it is with standoffs like this, male to female standoffs, where the screw goes up into the bottom of the standoff, and then the standoff set is both the spacer and the screw for the next board. The way that I'm doing it here is stronger because you have these metal screws going all the way up through. But whereas with the nylon spacers, the nylon screw can break relatively easily. And you often don't notice that it's broken until your quad starts flying really weird because your flight controller is just flapping in the wind. The disadvantage of this method is that, well, first of all, especially with the way this setup is, these screws are going to be held really rigidly, and it's going to be hard to get the board down onto them because they probably are not perfectly perpendicular. Now this board, the flight controller we're using here, has room for gummies, for vibration isolating gummies, and that's going to give it enough flex, but it'll be easy. But let's try this PDB. Let's see. Oh, that's not too bad. That's 2 out of 4. So, okay, we'll see how that goes. The other disadvantage of this method is that it does transmit more shock to the electronics in a crash and can be more likely to damage the electronics. It's sort of a toss-up. All 4 screws have been installed. We're using the 36mm holes here on the outside, not the 20mm holes on the inside, because that's the size of the flight controller we're going to be using. And here's what it looks like from the other side. We need to put a spacer on here to keep the bottom board, whatever it may be, from touching the carbon. If it touches the carbon, it's usually an ESC or a PDB, and it'll ground out and it'll make the fire come out. So I like to do that with M3 nylon screws. Because they're just, they're 2.5, maybe, I think they're maybe 2 or 3 millimeters, probably 2 millimeters. And that gives you just enough spacing that you get just enough spacing for clearance, but you don't waste any stack height. Now we're going to do something that I almost never do on a build, and that is, what's this thing? This is a PDB, and I haven't used one of these in literally years. In fact, I just by sheer chance had this sitting in a drawer somewhere and hadn't thrown it out. And a PDB is used when you are using a flight controller that is not an all-in-one. This is not, I overlooked this when I planned this build. This is not an all-in-one flight controller. It does not have a PDB built in. So where are we going to solder our ESCs? We're going to solder them to this here PDB. Yikes. There, good. Okay. And I've chosen the length of these screws poorly because these screws are so long. I'm not going to be able to get another standoff on top. I'm going to need to use like a spacer. Oh yeah, that'll work. This great big inductor on here needs some space anyway. It's not going to leave me any room for anything else though, but maybe. I'm going to take the positive and the negative wires and I'm going to cut them to length. I'm going to leave myself a little bit of extra slack as always, just to give me room to screw up. This would be a little easier to do if I had taken the standoffs off, but we'll make it work. Here, the ESC power wires are connected to the PDB. I almost hesitate to spend too much time instructing you on this because literally nobody these days is going to be working with a PDB. Imagine this was your all-in-one flight controller. You'd solder them up. So the next thing we're going to do is, well, the next thing we're going to do is double check that red goes to plus and black goes to minus, and you didn't accidentally screw that up. And it's not a bad idea to check here on the ESCs. If you apply power with the wires reversed, you will fry something pretty bad. So just take 1 second and double check, and then we'll proceed. In case it's not obvious from my insane close-up just there, I screwed up one of these. I wired the ESC power wires backwards because I made an assumption about which way the PDB was wired up. Or actually the labeling looks a little unclear, but probably I just got careless. I will fix this later, but if you're following along at home, don't make my mistake. And definitely don't just blindly follow my wiring. Who am I kidding? You're not using this PDB anyway. This PDB hasn't existed for 2 years. Anyway, I just want you to know I saw the mistake and I acknowledge it. Please don't fill up the comments. We'll make the power lead. I'm using 14 gauge wire for the power lead, XT60 lead. 12 gauge is acceptable but not required. Any more than 12 gauge is total overkill. Some people are concerned about using such small wire when we're pulling like sometimes 60, 80, or 100 amps. And if you look at a table of suggested wire gauge, it'll tell you you need way bigger wire than this for 60, 80, or 100 amps. But we never pull that amps for very long. Even if we pull, when I do my battery testing, I have pulled 120 amps through 12 gauge wire. Well, to be fair, 12 gauge wire on an XT60 for a minute, and nothing melted, nothing lit on fire. It got hot and the battery ran dry. It ran out before I could get to the point where it could hurt anything. So yeah, 12 gauge is more than sufficient for even like a high-end racing rig where you're just going to be full throttle till you suck the battery dry. And for a typical cruiser or freestyle, 14 gauge is more than sufficient. In case you missed it, I like to turn these sideways, make it a little easier to work with. And then we'll use some of this is called Fun Tack. Oh, it won't stick to the silicone. That's cute. This stuff is called Fun Tack, F-U-N-T-A-C-K. It's made by Loctite. It's available in various other places as well under other names. And it's really good for use on the bench like this. Just, yeah. Good opportunity to double check that you're soldering the right wire to the right place. Red wire to the plus, black wire to the minus. Double check every time and you'll never screw it up. Double check twice. Double check 3 times. You don't get a chance to do it a second time after you plug the battery in and get it wrong. Stuff's gonna smoke. You don't need to apply excess pressure when soldering like this. Pushing down harder will not get the heat into it faster. Just touch, and wait for the solder to flow and the heat to get into the joint. If you're touching and the joint is not flowing, the solder is not going into it. That may be because your iron tip is corroded. Various reasons. Iron may not be hot enough. The joint will flow. I'm just adding a little solder here and reflowing it. The joint will flow, become liquid. There we go. And then everything will come together very nicely. That's what you want to see. It's a pretty decent one. Yeah. It's a pretty decent one if I do say so myself. I'll often end up with excess solder flowing around to the backside. That hasn't happened here. Nice full cup. Everything has become liquid and smooth. That's what you want to see. The XT60s that I buy come with these little plastic shrouds. You can also add heat shrink. I often don't. If the joint is, heat shrink would protect against this maybe coming loose and something, but mostly I'm just worried about it shorting against something else. There you go. So that's often how I'll do it. Just like that. I run my iron at 850, which is as hot as it'll go for like, especially the negative lead, the negative pad. It usually takes extra heat because the ground plane is very heavy on a PDB. How are we going to do this? How long do I want this? I haven't really thought. I don't know this frame well, so I'm not sure how long I'm going to want the battery lead to be. You don't want it too long because it does have some resistance, and you'd be more likely to get into the props if it's excessively long. Once again, an opportunity to make sure that you're soldering the right wire in the right place. Yeah, that's more secure. There we go. It's a good old joint. When I tinned the wire, they were a little dry. Now they are not dry. They had enough solder to finish the joint. Flow would be nice. I'm going to take my multimeter. I'm going to put it into continuity mode. That's this little symbol here. And when it's in that mode and the probes touch, they beep. And I want to test for continuity between the positive and the negative to make sure I didn't screw that joint up. And now I don't have any beeping when I touch. You saw I actually had, just for a second, I had a tiny little beep. And that's because the capacitor on this PDB took a little bit of charge. I'm going to short it right now. Okay, I'm discharging the capacitor. Now when I touch again, I should get a short beep and then stop. That's fine. Good. That's fine. If there's a continuous beep, it means you have a short circuit. You should stop and not proceed because something is wrong. Normally I would like to put some strain relief on this guy, and I do that by strapping it to a standoff, but there isn't really a convenient standoff. This is the trouble of working with a frame you're not familiar with. But there you go. We're also going to need a power and a ground wire for the flight controller from this PDB's regulator. I guess we could just run it straight from the flight controller can take battery voltage natively. It's made for that, but we could take it straight from here. But I'm going to go ahead and use this ground and VCC, which is battery voltage. VCC is another word for battery voltage. Sometimes it'll also be labeled VBAT. I'm going to use these two pads. These are actually look like they're intended for the camera, but we're not actually running anything through this PDB except the ESCs. So everything else will just wire to the flight controller as intended. Basically, this PDB is taking the place of a 4-in-1 ESC that we're not using. I want to show you, by the way, prep is so important to successful soldering. A well-prepped wire, if your wire doesn't look like that when you go to solder it, a nice thin twisted end with no frayed loose parts. It's nice, maybe 2 millimeters or so, about the size of the pad that you're soldering to, not much larger, so it doesn't extend past the edge of the pad. If your wire doesn't look like that, stop, go back, do more prep. I know that's boring and you just want to get the quad in the air, but good prep makes for good soldering. Bad prep makes for quads that fall out of the sky and don't know why. Bracing with my finger here against the board helps me keep my hand steady. I'm going to place the wire where it needs to be, and then I'm going to just come in and I'm going to actually try to flow the pad, and just with the tiny wires like this, they'll just get sucked right up into the pool of solder on the pad once it's liquid. There you go. I don't even hardly need to touch the wire, frankly. I mean, you will, but yeah, there you go. Here's the Lux F7 flight controller. We're going to put the gummies in, and I'm not sure how hard or easy these are going to be to put in. There's a trick to doing this where you take some dental floss and you pull it through. These ones actually seem like they're going in pretty easily. Sometimes, like on my flight controller, they're pretty tight. I'm putting them in with the thick side up because I'm an idiot. I had the wrong side up. Make sure the front-facing arrow is facing the front of the quad. And yes, even a CheaterKwad has a front. On this frame, these little holes here seem to be drilled in the front. You can fix that after the fact if you need to, but it's better to get it right. So here's the camera plates. The camera plates on the Lindworm have a great feature here where you can set how far forward or back the camera is just by choosing what screw holes to use here. It's very clever. Lindworm didn't invent that, as far as I know. I've seen it on other frames anyway, but it is still really nice and clever. Also, super happy on this camera plate that the slot for the top and the bottom is a different size, which means that it's keyed. It means you can't accidentally put it in upside down, facing the wrong way. Good design. I want to see where we need to put this to get the camera approximately flush with the front standoffs. Maybe slightly back of the front standoffs. There we go. That way it's well protected in a crash, and that's, of course, what you want. The camera on the front here is the Runcam Sparrow. It's a very nice CMOS camera if you don't like CMOS cameras. It has a much more natural image, although there's still some of the CMOS noise that some people object to. It's not perfect, but it is nice. I have a review of it on my channel, RunCam Sparrow. It's a Sparrow V2, I think. Yeah, so check that out. I can't remember if, when I first saw this frame, if these slots were drilled here. I kind of think they weren't. And I kind of think he added these slots on the back just for me because he knew I was doing a CheaterKwad. Maybe if this video is popular, he'll make that a regular option. So this is going to be our back-facing camera. And again, the ability to easily set the distance means that the fact that this is a RunCam Racer, which is a little bit shorter, doesn't matter. We can just set it exactly where we want it. Okay. Oh, it's starting to look like a CheaterKwad now. And where's that VTX gonna go? So now we got to figure out where the video transmitter and the receiver are going to go. And normally they would go back here, but the back-facing camera is going to go there. And also, normally this flight controller would be used, it's designed for use with a 4-in-1 ESC. So we'd have all this room here. But since we're breaking all these rules, because I just wanted to use these ESCs. What can I tell you? I want to try the F3 ESCs. So we got to struggle to make everything fit. I've got, I think, just about the perfect size standoffs to give me just enough, having enough room on top, plenty of clearance in between the flight controller and the top plate to get like the battery strap through. I think this is going to work. We're going to find out. The VTX is going to be a Unify HV. A Unify 5 volts would be even better because they're so small. But I'm using this one largely because it's one of the thinnest VTXs you can get that is a full power VTX anyway. You can get nano VTXs like the Ready-Made RC Cricket Nano. The Unify has a nano version as well. Holy Bro has a nano. That's fine. Those guys are all much smaller. The problem is they only go up to 200 milliwatts, although the Unify Nano goes up to 400. So this is one of the smallest, if not the smallest, full power VTXs available. And one of the ways it accomplishes that is it doesn't have a screen, which is fine because it's just used with smart audio all the time anyway. And I think I can just squeeze this. Oh yes, just like that. There you go. This tape that I'm using is Scotch Extreme Outdoor Mounting Tape. It's great for this kind of application. I wouldn't use it to hold the VTX. Like if it weren't squished between two things and had nowhere to go, I'd put a zip tie on it. I may still put a zip tie on it just to hold it in place, but it'll probably be fine. In the right circumstances, this stuff holds like crazy. In fact, it can actually rip small capacitors and stuff off of boards if you go a little overboard with it. So a little goes a long way. Except when it doesn't, then your stuff just comes off. It's kind of unpredictable, honestly, when it will and won't stick securely. Anyway, it's good stuff. You should have it. Just don't necessarily 100% depend on it. New plan. I do not have, I want to use a FlySky receiver on this for reasons. And I do not have any small FlySky receivers other than this one, which is it's a micro receiver. It doesn't have full range. And I'm not going to do that because then when it fail safes, then that won't be good. So I'm using this receiver, which is the smallest one I have, and I'm going to try and like cram it in here and then hope I'm going to give up on the Unify. I'm going to use a micro VTX instead and hope, I'd rather have sketchy video that I can kind of fly through or turn around than sketchy control that kills me when I fail safe. I've wrapped this receiver in something called Kapton tape, Kapton. It is on my Ultimate FPV shopping list website. I like to use it. By the way, the link to that is down in the video description. Naturally, I like to use Kapton tape instead of clear heat shrink. Sometimes I think it's a little more versatile. It's certainly thinner in most cases. And yeah, that's what I like to use. So there you go. Now I will have to find some place to put this VTX, but I feel like that's going to be more manageable. The VTX, this VTX only goes up to 200 milliwatts, but we'll get her done. And I think it's going to fit. Like, I don't even know where I'm going to freaking put it. I could probably get it like here or so. Ooh, what about like under the camera? Got potential. See? As good as heat shrink. No. Okay, so it's got to go this way. Let's put it right there. We'll figure out what to do with the antenna later. Naturally. We just have to solder up the flight controller, and we have got ourselves a quad. For the video transmitter, we got 5 wires. Red is power, black is ground, yellow is video. That's the standard. That's almost always going to be the case. And then this brown one is going to be for smart audio. Smart audio has nothing to do with audio, confusingly. It is just to let us remote control the video transmitter via the flight controller. So the flight controller can command the video transmitter to change output power or channel without having to push any buttons or anything. Try not to tin over your electronics because the blob of solder can spatter onto your electronics. Professional kids. And let's see, on this flight controller, we've got VTX. Well, that's clearly for the video. And ground. Well, that's clearly for the ground for the VTX. Then we got another ground. I don't know what that's for. We got a VBAT here. That's fine. That's good. That's to power the VTX. And then let's put T3 as the smart audio. I don't know if that's how it's intended. This Lumenier Lux uses the top and bottom of the board, so they may intend the UART for smart audio to be on the top. And when I'm not doing an ultra clean board, build, I will just take the slack out of the wire by coiling it up like this, and that'll help keep it neat and out of the way. Not getting chopped by props or anything nasty like that. Now the receiver. Oh, that's not the front. The front is this way. Okay. Make sure you don't pinch those wires when you're pressing down. I think that's all we need on the bottom of the board. The receiver is gonna go on the other side. We will solder on the bottom. Yeah, as long as we're soldering on the bottom, let's have a party. Let's solder on the bottom. 4v5 R1 T1. Yeah, that seems like where the receiver should go. Usually when they say 4v5, that means 4.5 volts. And you say, well, what happened to 5 volts? I thought we gave 5 volts to our receivers. Well, a lot of times the flight controller will be set up so that the receiver gets power when USB is plugged in, so that you can test your receiver out without having to plug in your LiPo and risk, powering up the motors and chopping off your face. And in order to make that happen, they need to put a diode between the 5-volt rail and that pad so that the other stuff on the flight controller is not powered from USB. Like you wouldn't want your VTX or, God forbid, your motors powering on when you plug in USB. So that diode drops, I think, 0.6 volts. This is what it typically drops. Sometimes it depends on the type of diode you use. And so the receiver S-bus pad, or the receiver power pad that is powered from USB, will only have 4.5 volts on it. When you see a flight controller where the power pad says 4.5 volts or 4v5 instead of 5 volts, that usually means, number one, it's intended for the receiver, and number two, it will be powered from USB, unlike the other 5-volt pads. Prep is key, folks. Prep makes good solder joints. Good prep makes good solder joints. Bad prep makes terrible solder joints. Now, because this is an F7 flight controller, we can use any UART we want for our receiver. We do not have to worry about inversion problems like on F4 flight controllers, where we would have to use an uninverted UART for iBus, which is the protocol that FlySky uses, and we would have to use an inverted protocol or UART for S-bus, which is the protocol that FreeSky uses. We can just use any UART that we prefer based on where we like to solder the wires. R1, yellow wire is iBus, power and ground. Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness, folks. Could it be? Could it be? Where's the front? Oh, I've lost track of where the front of the quad is, but I've got it now. Could it be, get that little twist here, that we are ready? That we've got this baby soldered up, you know? See right here where it's trying to pinch the wires. Don't let that happen. Silicone insulation especially will totally just pinch and be ruined. You'll get a short circuit potentially. That's it. That's everything. Now, I haven't even powered it on yet. So the smoke check. Oh, no, it isn't. The cameras. I got to wire up the cameras, doofus. I knew there was something. I knew it was too simple. In order to get these screws on top, it is okay if you crush the gummies just a little bit. It does slightly reduce the vibration isolation, but it's not the end of the world. And sometimes it's just all you can do. A workaround is to use a female-female standoff instead of a female to male, and then use a screw down into the top instead of using a nut like I'm doing. Lastly, the camera headers. Yep, that'll work. Okay, we've got camera 1 and camera 2, 5 volts, and ground. Oh, I also got to do the ESC signal wires, derp. And I've got the power header for both of these twisted together. So both cameras are going to get powered from 5 volts together. And ground together. Get out of the way. And then the video is going to be camera 1 and camera 2 separately, obviously. And I'm not sure it matters which is camera 1 and camera 2, but just on principle, I'm going to make the front-facing camera be camera 1. Normally, the Lumenier Lux F7 gets its power through the 4-in-1 plug. Since we're not using a 4-in-1, as I have pointed out several times, we're going to use the VBAT and ground pad just to the side. This pad is probably intended for to power an accessory device, but an input and an output, there's not really any difference on a flight controller. A VBAT pad is a VBAT pad. So we can power the board using VBAT the same way. Nice blob of tinned fresh solder there on the pad. That's going to help make sure that the joint, oh, there you go. That's much better. Oh yeah, nice. Okay, now the flight controller has power. And now we're going to do the signal wires. And we're going to do that for all 4 of the ESCs. Signal 1, signal 2. Where are you? Oh my goodness. Signal 4, signal 4, and signal 3. So all 4 of the ESC signal wires are just going to go in. All right, folks, this is it. The build is very nearly complete. I just want to show you a couple things I did off camera. So I soldered up the signal wires. As you can see, that's all the soldering and stuff done. I have installed the antenna. I want to show you that this is a terrible way to install an antenna. Sometimes racers do this because they want low profile and they don't need a terribly large amount of range. But especially for a freestyle quad, this is a horrible way to install the antenna. It needs to be away from the carbon. It needs to be out from the shadow of the, oh my gosh, it's on the front freaking arm. No, that's the back. Sorry. I forget which is the front or the back. If it was on the front, that'd be really bad because it would take a hit. Anyway, so this will get me in the air. The only reason I'm doing this is because this silly micro VTX that I had to go with, and I had to jam it in somewhere where it wouldn't really fit. Well, it's just didn't want a connector sticking out here at the front. So this is just the best I could come up with. Don't emulate this if you care about having good range. And then for the receiver antennas, the approach that I like to make is I just take a zip tie and I pass it around the arm. I pass it underneath the motor wires because I don't want to pinch the motor wires or anything like that. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take some heat shrink. This is 3/32 size heat shrink, 3/32 of an inch. I don't know what that is in millimeters. And just going to heat shrink this to the arm, to the zip tie, just like that, basically. Yeah, just shrink that down and snip the end off and you're good to go. So we'll button this frame back up and then we'll do the setup. Well, folks, this is one of those moments where the know-it-all has to fess up that even he's not perfect. So when I went to plug this in, thank goodness I used a smoke stopper light bulb. It's a current limiting device. You can get them from race day quads, or you can make your own from an automotive bulb. And they help protect you from frying things when you make mistakes. One of the mistakes I made is that I had these two wires reversed. On a lot of PDBs, they will put the two ground pads on the inside and the positive pads on the outside so that these two pads can basically share a trace inside the board. And so I did not take my own advice and double check plus to plus, minus to minus. And I had these two reversed. And it doesn't seem like it's done any damage to this ESC. Hopefully it hasn't, thankfully, because I used the smoke stopper. Hopefully it was all right, but I don't know. We'll have to see. I may end up replacing this ESC if I go to Maiden. The other thing is, and I don't know what was wrong with me, but I got the wiring here all freaking wrong. Okay, so mistake number one was I got my VTX and my VBAT backwards. I think what I did was I put the power here on VTX because I was thinking some flight controllers will label VTX for VTX power and CAM for CAM power, but VBAT is the power that I intended to use. However, even that was a mistake because the frickin' Unify or the frickin' Holybro Nano VTX is 5-volt powered, not frickin' VBAT. And the saving grace here is hopefully because the freaking ESC was wired backwards, the flight controller never powered up, and hopefully it didn't fry my VTX by feeding VBAT into a 5-volt powered VTX, you freaking bonehead. So yeah, know your specs on your gear. Got a little overconfident there. And then here's our video wire. And that is going to go to VTX. Okay, there you go. We got the cameras. We're not using those. I'm just going to try to power this up right now and see if it powers up and if everything's okay. Hallelujah. Cameras. Let's give it a camera. And let's see if we get video on my goggles or if I fried the VTX. Smoke stopper will really have saved the day in more ways than one if I did not fry anything. Yes. Well, it's still not a guarantee because sometimes like it seems to work on the bench, but then you get it out in the field and it doesn't, and it's got like terrible range or it's actually screwed up. But for the time being, it appears that I have dodged a bullet. Oof, that was a close one. That was painful. That was a painful mistake. It was a dumb mistake. Here I am talking to you guys and being like, hey, make sure you check everything. And is the rear camera not going to work? It's not cut to the right size. It's not going to work. I got to use the plastic things after all. So I have ended up going with the 3D printed camera brackets on the back side because the top plate, these slits are not cut sized for the camera brackets. The bottom plate it's obviously, I think it's not made for the camera brackets. There's not intended to be a camera there. We're just winging it. So that's what we're going to go with. There we go. It's going to be iffy. I think you're going to be able to see just a little bit. Well, and there we go, folks. That is the build of the CheaterKwad's Lindworm frame. This is the Lumenier Lux F7 Ultimate Flight Controller. This is the Runcam Racer 2 on the back, and this is the Runcam Sparrow on the front in a CheaterKwad configuration, and these are the Lumenier Zip 2207 2450 kV motors with the Holy Bro Nano VTX and the FlySky. I think it's the FSI 6 receiver. Yeah, we're doing FlySky in this one because I'm going to be testing the Nirvana, and I'm also going to be testing another FlySky radio that you may not have heard of yet. So the next thing we need to do is we need to just get a baseline Betaflight configuration on this. I'm not going to show you guys that because I've got a million setup videos for Betaflight, and then I'm going to release the video showing how to actually set up the CheaterKwadiness of it. Stay tuned for that on another day. That's going to do it for this video, though. Thank you guys so much for watching. Links to all of this stuff are down in the video description. It means a lot to me if you use them because a lot of them are affiliate links, and that's one of the easiest ways for you to support the channel. Click the affiliate link. But before you make any purchase, not just these items, you can just every day, just wake up, click that affiliate link, make sure that cookie stays fresh. And whenever you shop at your favorite vendors, I will get a small commission. I also have a Patreon where you can support me for a couple bucks a month if that's more your speed, or heck, do both, right? What is it? Yeah, it's no big deal. Thank you guys. That's going to do it for this video. Happy flying.